September 1939. The Polish sky darkens with German bombers. Tanks roll across borders. A generation that swore never again watches in horror as Europe plunges back into the abyss. How did it come to this? To understand the second great catastrophe, we must return to the first. 20 years earlier, in November 1918, a different German army had marched, not in conquest, but in retreat. 4 years of industrial slaughter had bled their nation white. The Kaiser had fled to Holland. American, British, and French forces were crushing what remained of German resistance. In the cities, people starved. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. Europe counted its dead. 10 million soldiers, countless civilians. The world exhaled. But in Germany, a poison was already spreading through the national psyche. The army hadn't been defeated on the battlefield. That's what the generals told anyone who would listen. No enemy had marched through Berlin. No foreign flag flew over German soil. They had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by politicians, by socialists, by Jews. The Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth, would fester like an infected wound. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe with the swagger of a prophet. America had entered the war late and emerged victorious. Now Wilson would remake the world according to liberal ideals. His vision was elegant, almost naive. A league of nations where disputes would be settled by diplomacy, not artillery. At Versailles, outside Paris, the victors carved up the map of Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that centuries-old colossus, was dismembered. New nations sprouted from its corpse. Poland reborn after 123 years. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Baltic states. Old empires became new democracies overnight. Germany itself was gutted. Territories seized, colonies stripped away, its military reduced to a token force. And then came the final humiliation. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany alone bore responsibility for the war. The bill for damages? £6.6 billion in reparations, an astronomical sum that would cripple the economy for decades. But here's the bitter irony. Wilson's grand vision died before it could take its first breath. Back home, the U.S. Senate looked at the League of Nations and saw a trap, a mechanism that could drag America into Europe's endless conflicts. They rejected it. The architect of the New World Order went home defeated, and America retreated into splendid isolation. The League of Nations would limp forward without its most powerful potential member. It was a peace treaty built on sand. The new Germany was unrecognizable. Gone was the militaristic monarchy. In its place, the Weimar Republic, a democracy born in defeat and chaos. It never stood a chance. The streets became battlegrounds. Communist revolutionaries, inspired by Lenin's recent triumph in Russia, tried to spark their own uprising. Right-wing militias, the Free Corps, veterans who refused to disarm, fought them in brutal street battles. The government, weak and indecisive, seemed powerless to restore order. Then came 1923, and with it, economic apocalypse. Hyperinflation consumed Germany like wildfire. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. A loaf of bread cost millions of marks, then billions, then trillions. Workers carried their wages in wheelbarrows, only to find them worthless by the day's end. Life savings evaporated. The middle class was destroyed overnight. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than buying coal. Into this chaos stepped a man who understood rage better than anyone. His name was Adolf Hitler. He'd been nobody special, an Austrian failed artist who'd found purpose in the trenches of the Great War. Hitler had fought bravely, earned the Iron Cross, and like millions of others, struggled to adjust to peace. Germany's defeat burned in him like acid. In Munich's beer halls he discovered his gift: oratory. When Hitler spoke, something magnetic happened. He channeled the fury and humiliation of an entire nation. He offered simple explanations for complex problems. Germany hadn't lost the war. It had been betrayed. By Marxists, by the Weimar politicians, by Jews. He promised redemption through strength, through racial purity, through the reclamation of Germany's rightful place as Europe's dominant power. In 1923, drunk on his own rhetoric and the adulation of followers, Hitler attempted a coup d'état in Munich. It was a fiasco. The beer hall putsch collapsed within hours. Hitler was arrested, tried, and sentenced to prison. But prison gave him time to think, to write, to plan. In his cell, he produced Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a rambling manifesto that laid out his vision with chilling clarity. Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, in the East. The Slavic peoples would be subjugated or eliminated. The Jews were an existential threat. Democracy was weakness. Only through authoritarian rule and military might could Germany rise again. Most people who read it thought it was the ramblings of a fanatic. They were right. They were also catastrophically wrong to dismiss it. After his release, Hitler changed tactics. No more coups. He would use democracy to destroy democracy. The Nazi Party became disciplined, organized, relentless. And for 5 years, they remained on the fringes. Weimar Germany actually stabilized in the late 1920s. The economy recovered. People started to hope. Then Wall Street crashed. October 1929. The American stock market collapsed, and the shockwaves rolled across the Atlantic like a tsunami. The brief prosperity vanished. Unemployment in Germany soared past 6 million. Banks failed. Factories closed. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Democracy, it seemed, had no answers. Extremism flourished. The communists surged on the left. The Nazis surged on the right. Hitler's brown-shirted stormtroopers, the SA, became a parallel army 3 million strong, beating up opponents in the streets, smashing up rival political meetings, creating an atmosphere of chaos that made his promises of order sound appealing. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in the Reichstag. Hitler still didn't have a majority, but he had leverage. The government was paralyzed. The aging President Hindenburg, a relic of Imperial Germany, made a fateful calculation. Better to bring Hitler into the government where he could be controlled. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The conservatives thought they could manage him. Within months, they realized their mistake.
February 27th, 1933. Flames consumed the Reichstag building, the seat of German democracy. Hitler's response was immediate. This was a communist plot, the beginning of a revolution. He demanded emergency powers. Hindenburg, frightened and manipulated, agreed. With emergency powers in hand, Hitler moved with ruthless efficiency. Opposition parties were banned, critics were arrested. Stormtroopers became auxiliary police. The Enabling Act passed, allowing Hitler to make laws without the Reichstag's approval. Democracy didn't die with a bang, it was suffocated, legally, step by step. When Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler simply merged the positions of president and chancellor. He was now the Führer, the leader, answerable to no one. Germany was a dictatorship, and millions cheered. For ordinary Germans, the next few years seemed like a renaissance. Hitler poured money into massive public works programs. The Autobahn system stretched across the country, providing jobs to hundreds of thousands. Unemployment plummeted. Prosperity returned, or seemed to. What people didn't see, or chose not to see, was where the money was really going. Behind closed doors, Germany was rearming on a staggering scale. The Treaty of Versailles had limited the German army to 100,000 men, banned tanks, submarines, and aircraft. Hitler ignored all of it. Since 1923, Germany had secretly developed tank designs in the Soviet Union, circumventing Versailles through cooperation with another pariah state. German officers studied the theories of British tank warfare pioneers like Little Hart and Fuller. They developed the concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, combining tanks, motorized infantry, and aircraft in coordinated, devastating assaults. By 1935, Hitler felt confident enough to unmask his creations. He revealed the Luftwaffe, a modern air force with 2,500 aircraft, more than Britain and France combined. He announced the expansion of the army to 300,000 men and the reintroduction of conscription. Britain and France issued formal protests. They did nothing else. Hitler had called their bluff. Now he would test them further. In 1935, the Saarland, a coal-rich region on the French border, voted overwhelmingly to return to German rule. It had been under League of Nations administration since Versailles. Hitler celebrated it as a triumph of German national will. A year later, he made a bolder move. On March 7, 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone between Germany and France. This was a direct violation of Versailles. Hitler's generals were terrified. If France responded militarily, Germany would be crushed. They urged caution. Hitler overruled them. He understood what his generals didn't. France and Britain had lost the will to fight. And he was right. France did nothing. Britain did nothing. Many in both countries felt, privately, that Hitler was only taking back what was rightfully German anyway. The Rhineland was German territory, after all. Why start a war over it? When the Berlin Olympics opened in August 1936, Hitler hosted the world. The spectacle was dazzling. German efficiency, German hospitality, German pride on display. Some visitors noticed the anti-Semitic signs had been temporarily removed. Many chose not to look too closely. Germany seemed stable, prosperous, peaceful. The mask was perfect, and behind it, Hitler was preparing for war. While Europe fixated on Germany, another power was making its own aggressive moves, thousands of miles away in Asia. Japan, a nation caught between tradition and modernity, was about to shock the world. At the turn of the century, Japan had stunned everyone by defeating Russia in 1905, the first time an Asian power had defeated a European one in modern warfare. During World War I, Japan fought alongside the Allies and emerged as a recognized world power, securing a seat at the table when the League of Nations was founded. But beneath the surface, Japan was a bundle of contradictions. Nominally a constitutional monarchy, real power lay with a feudal military caste that still revered the emperor as a living god. And Japan faced a crisis. Its population was exploding, its tiny islands couldn't feed everyone, and it had virtually no natural resources to fuel its growing industries. The solution to Japan's military leaders was obvious: expansion. Manchuria, in northeastern China, was perfect, vast, rich in coal and iron, lightly defended. Better still, Japan already had troops stationed there protecting Japanese economic interests. Other targets beckoned. Southeast Asia's colonies, British Burma and Malaya, French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, were ripe for the taking. But Japan had to be careful. Looming over the Pacific was a power that could crush Japan if provoked: the United States. America in the 1920s was a nation intoxicated by its own success. The economy was booming. Jazz filled the speakeasies. Stock prices soared. Fortunes were made overnight. The carnage of World War I seemed like a bad dream, best forgotten. America's army had been slashed after the war. Naval treaties with Britain, France, and Japan had essentially granted Japan superiority in the Western Pacific. Washington seemed not to care. The Philippines, Guam, and various Pacific islands were American possessions, but they seemed so distant, so irrelevant to a nation focused on domestic prosperity. Then came the crash, October 1929. The Jazz Age died in a single day. Banks failed. Unemployment exploded to 25%. Shantytowns, bitterly called Hoovervilles after President Hoover, sprang up in every major city. Americans who had been distracted by pleasure were now consumed by pain. Japan, watching carefully, saw its opportunity. In September 1931, Japanese officers in Manchuria staged an incident, a small explosion on a railway line near Mukden, blamed on Chinese saboteurs. It was a pretext, a lie, and everyone knew it, but it gave the Japanese military what they wanted, an excuse to invade. They didn't even inform their own civilian government in Tokyo. The army simply acted. Within months, all of Manchuria was under Japanese control. A puppet state called Manchukuo was proclaimed, with China's last emperor, the pathetic Henry Puyi, deposed in 1911 to serve as a figurehead. The League of Nations convened in Geneva. Manchuria was on the agenda. Japan was condemned, investigated, censured. The Japanese delegation listened politely, then walked out. The League suddenly confronted a terrifying truth. It had no enforcement mechanism, no army, no way to punish aggression except through economic sanctions that everyone knew wouldn't work. Japan became an international pariah. Japan didn't care. Emboldened, Japan looked south to China proper. It was an opportune moment. China was tearing itself apart. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government was locked in a brutal civil war with Mao Zedong's communists. Neither side could mount effective resistance to external aggression. In 1937, Japan signed the Anti-Communist Pact with Nazi Germany, ostensibly aimed at preventing communist expansion, but really about mutual recognition between aggressive powers testing the international order. In July 1937, Japanese forces provoked another incident near Beijing and launched a full-scale invasion of China. At first, the Chinese forces crumbled. Japanese troops swept through the north, capturing cities and ports in rapid succession. But the Chinese fought back with unexpected ferocity. Even the communists and nationalists formed a temporary united front against the foreign invaders. What Japan expected to be a quick conquest turned into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. The Japanese responded with atrocity. Cities were bombed indiscriminately. In Shanghai, the commercial heart of China, where thousands of Westerners lived, a 3-month siege left the city in ruins. Refugees fled before the advancing Japanese army. Then came Nanking. December 1937. Japanese forces capture Nanking, then China's capital. What followed was 6 weeks of systematic horror that still haunts history. Estimates vary, but over 300,000 civilians were massacred. The killing was industrial in its scale, recreational in its cruelty. Women were raped by the tens of thousands. Prisoners were used for bayonet practice, beheading contests, live burials. Even by the standards of a century that would perfect mass murder, Nanking stands out for its depravity. The world was appalled. Newspapers published eyewitness accounts from Western missionaries and journalists who had remained in the city. But appalled is not the same as acting.
On December 12, 1937, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the USS Panay, an American gunboat on the Yangtze River, killing 50 sailors. It was clearly deliberate. President Roosevelt wanted to impose a naval blockade on Japan, an act that would have brought the two countries to the brink of war. Britain, fearing exactly that outcome, refused to support him. All Roosevelt could offer China was a $25 million loan to buy weapons. The League of Nations issued another condemnation. Stalin's Soviet Union, theoretically sympathetic to revolutionary movements, sent a few hundred advisors but kept most of its forces focused on defending its own borders. China fought on alone, retreating deeper into its vast interior as Japan conquered the coast and major cities. The rhetoric of collective security, of international law, of the League of Nations, all of it had been exposed as empty words. And in Europe, another dictator was taking notes. Today, Benito Mussolini seems like a cartoon. All that bombastic posturing, the jutting jaw, the absurd speeches from balconies. But in the 1920s and 30s, he was taken very seriously indeed. Italy in 1922 was a mess. Strikes paralyzed the economy. Communist and socialist agitators seized factories and land. The democratic government seemed helpless. Mussolini, a former socialist journalist turned nationalist firebrand, organized his fascist movement. Unemployed veterans, angry nationalists, thugs looking for purpose. In October 1922, he gambled everything on a march to Rome. It was political theater more than military action, but King Victor Emmanuel III.
December 1937. Japanese forces capture Nanking, then China's capital. What followed was 6 weeks of systematic horror that still haunts history. Estimates vary, but over 300,000 civilians were massacred. The killing was industrial in its scale, recreational in its cruelty. Women were raped by the tens of thousands. Prisoners were used for bayonet practice, beheading contests, live burial. Even by the standards of a century that would perfect mass murder, Nanking stands out for its depravity. The world was appalled. Newspapers published eyewitness accounts from Western missionaries and journalists who had remained in the city. But appalled is not the same as acting. On December 12, 1937, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the USS Panay, an American gunboat on the Yangtze River, killing 50 sailors. It was clearly deliberate. President Roosevelt wanted to impose a naval blockade on Japan, an act that would have brought the two countries to the brink of war. Britain, fearing exactly that outcome, refused to support him. All Roosevelt could offer China was a $25 million loan to buy weapons. The League of Nations issued another condemnation. Stalin's Soviet Union, theoretically sympathetic to revolutionary movements, sent a few hundred advisors, but kept most of its forces focused on defending its own borders. China fought on alone, retreating deeper into its vast interior as Japan conquered the coast and major cities. The rhetoric of collective security, of international law, of the League of Nations, all of it had been exposed as empty words. And in Europe, another dictator was taking notes. Today, Benito Mussolini seems like a cartoon. All that bombastic posturing, the jutting jaw, the absurd speeches from balconies. But in the 1920s and 30s, he was taken very seriously indeed. Italy in 1922 was a mess. Strikes paralyzed the economy. Communist and socialist agitators seized factories and land. The democratic government seemed helpless. Mussolini, a former socialist journalist turned nationalist firebrand, organized his fascist movement. Unemployed veterans, angry nationalists, thugs, looking for purpose. In October 1922, he gambled everything on a march to Rome. It was political theater more than military action, but King Victor Emmanuel III panicked at the thought of civil war and invited Mussolini to form a government. Within a year, Mussolini had transformed Italy into a one-party state. Democracy was strangled. The fascist Grand Council held all real power. Elections became meaningless rituals. And like Hitler would later do, Mussolini made the trains run on time, or at least people believed he did. Massive public works projects created jobs. The mafia was crushed in Sicily through brutal but effective means. Corruption declined. Italy's infrastructure modernized. The economy improved, or seemed to. When the Great Depression hit, Italy weathered it better than most democracies. To many observers, including a young Adolf Hitler, fascism looked like the future. Strong, decisive, purposeful. Democracy, by contrast, seemed weak, paralyzed, obsolete. But Mussolini wanted more than admiration. He wanted empire. He wanted to resurrect Rome's ancient glory, and he had chosen his first target, Ethiopia. Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia, was one of the few African nations that had never been colonized. It had ancient Christian traditions, a proud warrior culture. In 1896, Ethiopian forces had humiliatingly defeated an Italian invasion at Adwa. Mussolini never forgot that defeat. Italy already held colonies bordering Ethiopia, Eritrea to the north, Italian Somaliland to the south. In December 1934, Italian forces engineered a clash with Ethiopian troops at a remote oasis well inside Ethiopian territory. Mussolini demanded reparations and apologies. Emperor Haile Selassie, a dignified and educated man, took his case to the League of Nations. Here was the ultimate test of collective security. A small, weak nation threatened by a larger aggressor, both members of the League. If the system meant anything, it had to act now. Anthony Eden, Britain's foreign secretary, attempted to broker a compromise. Mussolini rejected it. In October 1935, Italian forces invaded from both north and south. The outcome was never in doubt. Ethiopian warriors, brave but armed with rifles and spears, charged into Italian machine guns and artillery. Italian aircraft ruled the skies, dropping bombs and poison gas, the latter which a weapon banned by the Geneva Conventions as a crime against humanity. By May 1936, Italian forces entered Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie fled into exile. Mussolini proclaimed the birth of Italian East Africa. The League of Nations imposed economic sanctions. They were toothless. The aggressor had won, the victim had lost, and the lesson was clear to anyone watching. Might makes right. The League was a debating society, nothing more. Why didn't Britain and France act? Why didn't they stop Mussolini, or later, Hitler? The answer is written in blood and trauma. World War I had butchered an entire generation. Britain lost nearly 1 million men. France lost 1.4 million, proportionally catastrophic for a nation with a declining birth rate. Both countries had emerged victorious but broken, economically crippled, psychologically scarred. Britain's strategy after the war was simple: never again. The massive conscript army was demobilized. What remained was a small professional force designed to police the empire, not fight continental wars. When the Depression hit, military modernization was abandoned. Britain entered the late 1930s with an antiquated army, no stomach for conflict, and a government committed to peace at almost any price. France's situation was worse. Demographic decline meant that by the 1930s, France would face a severe manpower shortage. It could never match Germany in military strength. The solution was the Maginot Line, an elaborate system of fortifications along the German border that would, in theory, make invasion impossible. The Maginot Line was a symptom of a deeper problem. France had adopted an entirely defensive mindset. It could guard its own borders. It could not project power offensively. Even if Britain had wanted to attack Italy over Ethiopia, France lacked the military capability to help. Both nations' navies were outnumbered in the Mediterranean by Mussolini's fleet. Both nations were consumed by economic crisis at home. Both were desperate to avoid conflict. And so they did nothing. Not when Japan invaded Manchuria, not when Italy conquered Ethiopia, and soon, not when Hitler began his rampage through Europe.
July 1936. Spain erupts into civil war. It will last 3 years,
kill 500,000 people, and become a dress rehearsal for the greater conflict to come. Spain had been politically unstable for years. In 1931, a leftist coalition forced King Alfonso XIII into exile and proclaimed a republic. Reforms followed: land redistribution, separation of church and state, women's rights. To the conservative establishment, the Catholic Church, the military, the landowners, it looked like the beginning of a communist revolution. In February 1936, a popular front of leftist parties narrowly won national elections. Strikes and land seizures followed. The right panicked. Within the Spanish military, conspiracies formed. On July 17, Spanish military units in Morocco mutinied. The next day, General Francisco Franco flew from the Canary Islands to take command. He proclaimed a nationalist movement to save Spain from Bolshevism. Garrisons across Spain joined the revolt. The Republicans called for volunteers. The country split in two. Franco had one immediate problem. His best troops were in North Africa, separated from mainland Spain by the Straits of Gibraltar. He appealed to Hitler for help. Hitler's response was swift. Within weeks, German transport planes were airlifting Franco's Army of Africa across to Spain. It was the first large-scale military airlift in history. The Republicans controlled most of eastern Spain, including Madrid and Barcelona. The Nationalists held the northwest and parts of the south. It should have been an even fight. Then, Germany and Italy intervened massively. Hitler sent 12,000 troops, the latest panzer tanks, and the Condor Legion, an entire air wing equipped with modern bombers and fighters. This was Hitler's laboratory, a chance to test his weapons and tactics before the main event. Stalin sent some aid, tanks, aircraft, a few hundred advisors. It wasn't nearly enough. The most significant international support came not from any government, but from volunteers. The International Brigades, roughly 30,000 idealistic leftists from America, Britain, France, and even Germany who came to fight fascism. They fought bravely. They died in droves. By early 1937, Madrid was nearly encircled. The battle for the capital became symbolic. Democracy's last stand against fascist military might. The fighting was savage. Atrocities were committed by both sides. Republicans murdered Catholic priests. Nationalists executed anyone suspected of leftist sympathies. German and Italian aircraft bombed cities with impunity. On April 26, 1937, the Condor Legion obliterated the Basque town of Guernica during a market day. 6,000 civilians died. Pablo Picasso would immortalize the horror in his painting. The world expressed shock. Nothing changed. Behind Republican lines, the anti-fascist coalition was fracturing. Communists and socialists wanted military discipline, a centralized command to win the war. Anarchists and syndicalists saw the conflict as an opportunity for immediate social revolution. In May 1937, these tensions exploded into street fighting in Barcelona, Republicans killing each other while Franco's forces closed in. By the end of 1938, the Republic controlled only two isolated pockets around Madrid and Barcelona. The international brigades were withdrawn. More countries recognized Franco's government as legitimate. The end was inevitable. In March 1939, Madrid surrendered after nearly 3 years of siege. A month after, Franco declared victory. Spain's civil war left scars that remain to this day. But its international impact was immediate and catastrophic. Hitler and Mussolini learned that the democracies would not fight. Britain and France would wring their hands, issue protests, but take no action. Stalin learned that he could not rely on the West to resist fascism. If the Soviet Union was to survive, it would have to make its own arrangements. And Hitler learned something else. His weapons worked. Blitzkrieg tactics, modern tanks, strategic bombing, all tested, all proven. The rehearsal was over. The real performance could begin. Hitler hadn't hidden his intentions. On February 3, 1933, just days after becoming chancellor, he told his military commanders that Germany's ultimate goal was to conquer territory in the east and ruthlessly Germanize it. Everything since had been preparation. Germany's rearmament was no secret by 1935, but its scale shocked observers. Through secret cooperation with the Soviet Union dating back to 1923, Germany had developed advanced tank designs and trained officers in mobile warfare. German military thinkers had absorbed the lessons of British theorists about mechanized warfare and improved upon them. The result was the concept of blitzkrieg, fast-moving armored columns supported by aircraft and motorized infantry, punching through enemy lines and encircling defenders before they could react. It would revolutionize warfare.
The Luftwaffe, revealed in 1935, was already larger than the British and French air forces combined. The army had tripled in size, with more conscripts training every day. U-boats were under construction in defiance of Versailles. Britain and France protested. They also began, slowly and reluctantly, to rearm. But they were years behind. Until 1938, Hitler had moved cautiously. The Saarland and Rhineland were German territory. Reclaiming them was defensible. But Austria was different. A sovereign nation, however, German-speaking. In February 1938, Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg discovered another Nazi plot to seize power. He confronted Hitler, demanding respect for Austrian independence. Hitler's response was to demand the exact opposite. Austria must merge with Germany. Schuschnigg called for a referendum, gambling that Austrians would vote for independence. Hitler couldn't allow that. On March 12, 1938, the day before the vote, German troops crossed the border. There was no resistance. Nazi sympathizers in Austria welcomed the Wehrmacht with flowers and Nazi salutes. Within hours, Austria ceased to exist, incorporated into Greater Germany as the province of Ostmark. Britain and France issued formal protests. They did nothing else. Another line had been crossed, another sovereign nation erased. The precedent was set. Hitler's next target was Czechoslovakia, but he needed a pretext. He found it in the Sudetenland, the mountainous western region where 3 million ethnic Germans lived. They had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1919, when Czechoslovakia was created at Versailles. This was the poison pill in the post-war settlement. Germans living outside Germany, nationalist sentiment, and Hitler's rhetoric about unifying all German peoples. It was an explosive combination. Hitler encouraged Sudeten German demands for autonomy, then escalated to demands for unification with Germany. The Czech government refused and mobilized its army. Czechoslovakia was no pushover, well-armed, well-trained, with formidable border fortifications. Hitler actually backed down. But British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, terrified of stumbling into war, decided to intervene. He flew to Germany twice to meet Hitler. The Führer was charm itself. If only the Sudetenland could be peacefully transferred to Germany, there would be no more territorial demands. None. Europe could have peace. Munich, September 29th. Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, Hitler and Mussolini sign an agreement. Czechoslovakia, the nation whose fate is being decided, isn't invited to participate. The Sudetenland is handed to Germany. Hitler signs a declaration promising no further territorial ambitions. Chamberlain returns to Britain waving the piece of paper, proclaiming peace in our time. Crowds cheer. In France, Daladier is shocked by the enthusiastic reception. He expected to be lynched for betraying an ally. In Prague, the Czechs realize they've been sold out. Without the Sudetenland's mountains and fortifications, they're defenseless. On October 1st,
German troops occupy the Sudetenland. Hitler immediately begins planning his next move. Poland was next on the list, but Hitler had one more piece of unfinished business. In March 1939, he summoned Czech President Emil Hácha to Berlin and subjected him to hours of psychological torture, threats, screaming, warnings of aerial bombardment of Prague. Hácha, elderly and in poor health, collapsed. He was revived and forced to sign a document placing Czechoslovakia under German protection. Within hours, German troops occupied Prague and Bohemia. Slovakia became a German puppet state. For the first time, Hitler had seized non-German territory. The mask had slipped. Even Chamberlain couldn't pretend anymore. When Hitler turned to Poland and demanded the return of Danzig and the Polish corridor, the strip of land separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany, Britain and France finally drew a line. If Germany attacked Poland, they declared, it meant war.
Hitler didn't believe them, or didn't care. There was one potential obstacle: the Soviet Union. Germany and the USSR were ideological enemies. Hitler's writings and speeches dripped with hatred for Bolshevism. Stalin knew that ultimately Hitler planned to invade the Soviet Union. In April 1939, Stalin proposed an alliance with Britain and France against Germany. Negotiations dragged on for months. Stalin grew frustrated with Western hesitancy. And he had an alternative. On August 23, 1939, the world woke to shocking news. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. Hitler and Stalin, sworn enemies, had become partners. The agreement was pragmatic for both. Hitler could invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. Stalin bought time to prepare for the inevitable German attack. A secret protocol divided Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split. The Baltic states were assigned to the Soviet sphere. Stalin would have a free hand. Hitler now had everything he needed. August 31, 1939. Evening falls over Europe. In Germany, troops move into position along the Polish border. Tanks fuel up. Aircraft arm for the morning's first sorties. Hitler has made his decision. Tomorrow, the invasion begins. Britain and France will protest, issue ultimatums, perhaps even declare war. He's counting on them to back down, as they've done before. And if they don't, Germany will crush Poland in weeks, then turn west. In London and Paris, governments prepare for the inevitable. Chamberlain's policy of appeasement lies in ruins. There are no more compromises to make, no more territorial adjustments to accept. The line has been drawn. In Warsaw, Polish forces mobilize. They know what's coming. They also know they're likely doomed. But Poland has survived partitions before. The nation will endure. In Moscow, Stalin watches and waits. He's made his deal with the devil. Soon enough, he'll discover the price. The path that began at Versailles 20 years earlier, paved with humiliation, economic catastrophe, failed diplomacy, and appeased aggression, has reached its end. Tomorrow, September 1st, 1939, the world goes to war again. The second act of the 20th century's great catastrophe is about to begin. And this time, the horror will be beyond anything humanity has ever known.